Okay, let's have a look at the object properties for the fill stitches in the Bernina software. I'm going to start with the 5 fill stitches that are included in the creator level, which are steps fill, satin fill, raised satin, fancy fill and pattern fill, and they're shown down here next to the word fills. So step, satin, raised satin, fancy and pattern fill. Obviously you need a closed object to put a fill inside, so the fills only work with closed objects. So you can use your closed object digitizing tool, you can use your ellipse or your rectangle, and all of those are closed objects. So I've digitized a closed object here with the default step fill. And I've right clicked on the object, which opened up and chose object properties to open up the object property dialog. And we can see here that the fill type is the step fill, and it has default stitch spacing of 0.45 and a stitch length of 4 millimeters. And this is the effect you get, and this is sometimes called tatami fill. Now there are 30 patterns, and the patterns refer to where the needle penetrations are. So there's a fairly even staggered array of needle penetrations in the default step fill. If you want, you can choose any of these other 30 and you will get a dense fill if you go with the defaults that will cover the fabric and give you a nice even finish over the fill. So let's just have a look at a couple of these. So you can just make yourself an object and you can just choose all the step fills to have a look. They do give you a look here in the preview box, but you can also click on apply. The dialog will stay open and you'll see the difference. So this is a little different. If I undo back to the first one, it's a more regular. If I redo, it's a little bit more irregular. Let's have a look at it out of true view, and I will change the background to, I'm going to try this blue this time. The other one was a bit garish. Okay, that's better. So we can see those needle penetrations, and rather than staggered, they're a little bit more even. There's a couple. Let's turn off the underlay while we're doing this, because that is going to confuse us as far as the needle penetrations go. So I need to select it first, of course. Select it and turn off the underlay. That's better. So we can see that the needle penetrations are fairly regular here. You can see a few extra where it's had to travel to fill in the shape of the object. But other than that, we've got rows of needle penetrations. And if I go back to the original default step fill and remove the underlay from that, I have to go here, 1, and apply. There we go. That's pattern 1, and here's pattern 2. Apply. So not a huge difference. Let's keep going through. Pattern 3. Apply. Now they're definite rows. Let's have a look at that in true view, and we can see that we're getting more like a ribbed effect because our penetrations are very they're further spaced and they're very even. 4, apply, and this time we've got a different angle to the ribbing compared to the direction of the stitches. So if I take off the true view and we look, we've got diagonal rows of needle penetrations. So if I was to go to the reshape tool and change the direction of the stitching, the diagonal lines would go in a different angle as well. So that's important to know. So if I go back to true view, we're going to get those ribs in a different direction. Let's have a look at this one, and in a different direction again. So you can get those ribbed looks going wherever you like. Now I'm not going to go through every single type of fill stitch, but be aware that you can change the look again with the stitch angle, and obviously you would normally have an underlay. Put the underlay in, didn't really show much on here, but you would normally have an underlay under a step fill. And of course you've got your normal reshape tools where you can move your nodes. Okay, and there's your stitch angle. Right, now I'll take that underlay off again, and I'm going to play with the stitch spacing. So the stitch spacing actually refers to the density of the stitching, so it's the distance between each row of stitching. So if I turn off True View and zoom in, you've got these rows of stitching, and they are 0.45 millimeters apart, which is a fraction wider than a standard embroidery thread. The stitch length is maximum of 4 millimeters. Okay, you will see there are shorter stitches when you get towards the edge because it has to turn around and come back. It can't just do another 4 millimeter stitch, or it would be poking outside the edge of the boundary you've made. Just get that back to there. Alright, so if I was to change that stitch spacing, let's make it 0.9, so I will double it and apply, and you can see now that the stitch spacing is much further apart. If I bring it back to True View, there are now actually gaps between the stitches, between the rows of stitches I should say. So we've decreased the density by increasing the spacing. Making the rows further apart decreases the density. You probably don't want to play around too much with the stitch length, but it is possible to do that too. Now, if you do open up your stitch spacing, you will see travels if your shape is not a regular shape. So to avoid that, you would then want to go into the effects, click on the effects button, and under others, the others tab, you will see a travel on edges. So you can put a check mark next to that, and I'll just move this aside so you can see it happen. If I click apply, you will see now that that traveling has gone around the edge. If I get out of the reshape tool, it does, however, mean that you'll have a row of stitching that may or may not go all the way around. It may go around here a bit, and then it may go around here a bit. So usually if you're going to do this travel on edges, you would create some sort of border stitching so that you cover all the edges and make that look more regular. You don't always have to do that though. There's no stitch police. You can do what you like. When would you do this? If you want light stitching and you want to see a bit of the fabric through, or if you're going to layer stitching on top of each other, then you might not want such a dense stitching underneath. Another practical use for this would be, and you would probably open up even more, would be if you wanted to create your own underlay rather than use the inbuilt underlay. Of course, if you had underlay with this open stitching, let me just, while it's selected to turn that on, you would see the underlay underneath. So, and the travel for the underlay as well. So normally if you open up your stitching you would not have an underlay underneath, but you can also use this as an underlay. So when would you do that? If you want to create an underlay for the whole design rather than every single individual object, then you could just digitize around the outside of the design and open up your stitching even more. So if I go back to properties down here and I open that up to 2 millimeters say, and apply, I've got what looks like an underlay. So it's much more open, and I could do a single underlay. When it's good when you've got lots of little objects and you don't want to, you know, have separate underlays for all of them, or if you want to digitize more open stitching on top of this. Okay, let's that's really about all there is to tatami fill or step fill. Let's move on to the satin fill. Now you can have your object selected and you can change it to satin fill either by clicking on the satin fill down here, or up here in your object properties, if you have that open, you can choose satin fill from the drop down menu at the top and apply. You must apply for it to take effect. I've left the underlay off for the moment, but of course you would have an underlay under this as well. Now it's got a 0.4 millimeter spacing, so that's a little bit more dense. The stitches are a little bit closer together because satin stitches tend to float a little bit because they're such long stitches, depending on the size and shape of your object. Now if I go out of true view on this one, you can see that I've got actual stitches here, but when I get to this point here, I've got all these dotted lines with needle points through them. What's this all about? Well, the maximum satin stitch length has been exceeded, and so where it has been exceeded, it will actually put in little needle points. It won't actually stitch those needle points. It will treat this as jump stitches. So it will stitch this point here, it will jump to this point here, then it will jump to here without penetrating the needle, and then it will put the stitch in on this side. So you'll still get very long stitches, but it'll take a lot longer to stitch. The machine will be a bit slower because it'll hover over these needle points as it goes across. Now, that may not be desirable. If you're making a tassel, you would want that to happen. But if you were not wanting really long stitches, then you should choose Satin Special. So that's the option down here where it actually puts needle penetrations in. So if I click on Satin Special and apply that, we can see that we've got these needle penetrations all the way through, which will maintain a satin look. They're a bit irregular, and it'll maintain a satin look to the stitch for a larger area. It may or may not show, depending on the shape of the object. You may see a little bit of shadowing where these needle penetrations are. Let's go to True View, and in here you can see some shadowing in their depiction of it, but when it actually stitches out, it's not necessarily that obvious. It can be, depending on the shape of the object. It can be more obvious, but generally speaking, it blends in quite well. Let's go to 1:1 because I'm zoomed in 745%. So if I go to 1:1, you can see here the shadowing effect. So generally speaking, you would try to avoid using satin stitch in large areas. Okay, now I can automatic spacing isn't selected by default, but let's try doing a smaller object. So I'll get a closed object and I'm going to choose satin up here, and I'm going to make a very small little narrow leaf. Enter. Okay, and oh, it went back to step fill. Let's select it and make it satin. Okay, why isn't it going to satin? Satin, because I'm not hitting apply. Okay, right. So now this is a standard satin stitch, and if I go out of True View, there are no jumpy looking stitches because this is a narrow object. I probably would go to the reshape tool in this, and I would change my angle to run across this object. I just think it's nicer rather than having, and it does shorten a lot of the stitches because they're going across the object and not at an angle, 45-degree angle like this. But the angle of stitching is entirely up to you, depending on the effect you're trying to get. Now I'm in creator level and I can't choose automatic spacing for satin stitch in creator level. So I've got manual spacing, but I can increase or decrease that spacing. So if you want it, if you're not getting the coverage you want, and same with the tatami step fill, or the step fill I'm going to call it from now on because that's what it's called in our software, you can actually increase the density by reducing this number, and that will give you a better coverage, but do it gradually. You don't want to get it too dense. So you can either increase the density by reducing the number, or I'm going to open it up like we did before. So I'll make it 0.8 and apply, and there we go. Now again, I've got a travel stitch there, so I would need to travel on edges again through the effects and others. And oh, I can't travel on edges with a satin stitch, so that's interesting. So you may not want to open up your satin stitch fill to the point where you can actually see the travel runs underneath, or you may have to slightly reshape. So let me if I move the start point, yes, because I had another object here, it's applied closest join, so it's gone from the end of this one to the start of this one here. If I move that start point, I can eliminate that travel run in the satin stitch. And the same happens in a lot of other objects too. If you've got a nice even object like this where you can move from one end to the other without having to go around other little shapes, then you won't have any travel runs, provided your start is at one end and your end is at the other. So depending on whether you've got another object here, you may or may not have to manually move that start point. There's so much to think about when you're digitizing, but that will give you a more open satin. Now if I had an irregular shaped object, as I said, I'll do a closed object here. Let me see, trying to make an irregular shape. That's better. Yeah. And enter, and I'll select that and make it satin. Not satin outline, satin fill. There we go. Now I want to change my angle. Stitch angle, I would like to have it going in that direction, is more logical for this shape. Can I still get this without any travel run? Let's go out of true view. You can see there's lots of travel runs here underneath. So if I was to move the start to here and the end to the very end here, then I'm still going to get travel runs through here because of the shape. We could also, with this irregular, so I wouldn't open up the stitches, the density of this stitches for this object, but we could also go to the edit toolbox. So let's just get it selected, go to the edit toolbox, and we could add stitch angles, because at the moment we've just got one constant angle, which gives us some really long stitches here and then shorter stitches here. So let's add some stitch angles. And what I'm doing is drawing lines the shortest distance from one side to the other. So I'm following the curve basically. It's a bit interesting here. No, I don't like that one, but anyway, it's there. I can move them afterwards, that's not a big deal. I'll probably just leave that, enter. And I'll probably select this one by clicking on it and delete it. I'll undo that, because look what happened when I've changed my stitch angles. I've lost those travel runs. I have got some shortening of the stitches here because my angle coming this way and angle coming that way are too steep, and the stitches are bunching up here. So I will move this one a bit, then I get a travel run back. So you really have to be there we go, slight change to the shape, and I've only got a tiny little travel run down here. So there's lots of things to think about when you're making shapes if you want to start opening up stitches and you don't want to get them too, and you don't want to get any travel runs underneath. You can use stitch angles to simplify in some instances. Really depends on the shape. Okay, let's go back to true view. I've got the smallest little one here. And I can't seem to get rid of it. We'll go back to true view. It may well even have been a tie. Let's open up our stitch spacing back in properties. So we'll change this to 0.8 and enter, or if you enter it will actually close the dialog, and the same as pressing OK. And so that's what's happened, and I think I would get away with that, because if we went back to 1-to-1 and clicked off, you're never going to see that little bit there, and you could actually open up your stitching for this one. Let's go back to the object properties and zoom in. So that's about the measure of the satin fill. You've got satin, satin special if you've got a larger area, but try not to have larger areas of satin stitching if possible. And you've got a spacing option. Alright, let's delete those. And zoom back into our shape. And let's have a look at the third option in Creator Level, which is the raised satin, and apply that to this shape. I need to select it first and choose raised satin and apply. Okay, now we've got an extra option here. So again, I can't choose automatic spacing, but I can manually change my spacing. There's no stitch length here because there are layers of satin stitching now in this object. In fact, there are 3 layers plus the original object. The original object is still on top, and there are 3 layers underneath, and each of those layers is shorter, so the stitch length is really determined by the object shape. Let's go out of true view and zoom in. We have still got those jump style stitches on this one because it's so big, only on the top layer I think. But you can see here, if I zoom in really closely, that we've got layers underneath, and each layer is a little bit smaller than the other one, so it mounds the satin stitching up, raises it up, gives it a dimensional look. It does use a lot of thread and takes a while to stitch out, but it can be very effective. And just like with the raised satin outline, you can use it sparingly as a decorative effect to give a bit of dimension to your embroidery. Now you can change the number of layers. You can have 4, 5. 5's the most, and you can go down as low as 1, which will, if I apply that, we'll actually have 2 layers. We'll have 1 layer underneath and then the original layer on top. So if you want to create a more raised look and you don't want to go into the problems of doing trapunto or something like that, or putting puffy foam underneath or anything like that and trying to cover it, then the raised satin might be an option for you. Okay, and so the Creator Level has 2 more fills, Fancy Fill and Pattern Fill, and I'll be covering those in a separate video because they're quite involved. So this was a quick introduction. I've given you some extra information about stitching and so forth, so hopefully it's been worthwhile for you, and I hope you can include some of these fills and play around with them in your software to make your embroideries a little bit more interesting. And I'll see you or talk to you in the next video.